Okay, hello and welcome to Cambridge Skeptics Live. Cambridge Skeptics are a not-for-profit community organisation for the promotion of skepticism and positive skepticism and critical thinking skills in the Cambridgeshire area and beyond. Tonight we are joined by Dr Faye Skelton, who is going to talk about false confessions and the making of a murderer effect, which has got us all very excited. We've been picking our brains already this evening about it. So I will hand over to Faye to introduce herself better and to get the ball rolling.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks very much for joining me and inviting me, in fact. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to people who are excited about the same sorts of things that I'm excited by. So a nice way to spend a Tuesday evening. Not as glorious in Scotland as it is elsewhere in the UK, but still there's some light. There's still some sunlight. So I'm Faye Skelton. I'm a lecturer in psychology, cognitive psychology at Edinburgh Napier. And my key interest really is in miscarriages of justice. So I'm interested really in how these come about from mistaken eyewitnesses, from really bad use of lie detection or so-called lie detection that doesn't actually detect lies. But what's really piqued the public's interest in the last few years actually is the phenomenon that is false confessions. And we call this the making a murderer effect because it seemed to coincide with the release of the series Making a Murderer on Netflix. So Making a Murderer, for those that haven't watched it, there probably are a few people that haven't watched it. It started off with the case of Stephen Avery, who had been wrongfully imprisoned for rape and murder, and I think he'd been in prison for something like 18 years, got out of prison and was, I think, bringing legal proceedings against the police department that had seen him wrongfully imprisoned. During this time, when he was bringing these proceedings, a case was brought against him for the murder of a journalist called Teresa Halbach, who was alleged to have gone to Stephen Avery's family home, and they had like a car. Can't think of the name, but basically they had loads of cars. They worked on cars, and she's alleged to have gone there and not left there. So I don't have any knowledge that would tell me whether Stephen Avery is guilty or innocent. But what really piqued people's interest was the involvement of Stephen Avery's nephew, Brendan Dassey. And Brendan Dassey came to confess to playing a part in the murder of Teresa Halbach. And I think what really shocked the public was the way in which Brendan was questioned and the things he came to say. And I think as a result of this, there's been an enormous kind of uprising in interest in false confessions, how they come about. And there's perhaps still kind of disbelief about, well, that happened in a thing on the TV and it was over in America. It doesn't really happen here. And certainly there's really big differences between UK and US justice systems and other places in the world. But people do falsely confess, even though one study said that something like 94% of people, when asked, said they could never be persuaded to falsely confess to something that they hadn't done, or falsely confess to a crime that they hadn't committed. So we might acknowledge that it happens, we just don't think it happens to us. And when I go and do shows like at Edinburgh Fringe and science festivals and so on, I always ask the audience, has anyone ever confessed to a serious crime that you haven't committed? And everybody kind of titters a little bit. And I say, has anyone ever confessed to kind of a minor crime? And, everyone kind of looks at each other. Has anybody ever owned up to something like in the house or at school maybe that you didn't do? And then usually a hand or two will go up and people will say, actually, yeah, I have done that. I have owned up to something I didn't do for whatever reason. I don't kind of ask, but it does happen to kind of normal people, if you like. I think we think it happens to others. It doesn't happen to us. But it's quite interesting if you look at the statistics from the US Innocence Project, Innocence Projects are essentially organisations that are devoted to overturning wrongful convictions. And primarily this has taken off with the use of DNA evidence, where it's relatively easy, or much easier now, to rule somebody out of...
Oh.
Has anyone else lost Faye's audio?
Yep, I think I've lost Faye's audio as well. Oh,
It just suddenly...
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. So what I was saying, the Innocence Project in the US reported that out of the first 130 DNA exonerations, 27% of those cases involved a false confession.
Wow.
And we think it's around about 23% in the UK of kind of proven, if you like, wrongful convictions have involved a false confession. So it's a lot. It's a lot of people. It's very hard to get accurate statistics on these kinds of things, but anyway, it happens more than we might imagine. And it's really important because my slides are not moving on. There we go. There we go. So basically, as soon as you introduce a confession into the courtroom, it doesn't really matter what other evidence there is or isn't. We know that jurors don't really think that they would ever falsely confess. And so, although they might acknowledge that false confessions exist, they don't really think it's very likely. Judges know how false confessions come about. They know that people can be put into pressured interrogations, for example, and that there might be situations where people see it as the logical way out. But we don't really know how to incorporate it into our decision making. So although we might acknowledge that it happens, we don't really know what to do with the information that it happens. And jurors will say, even if you say, you've heard the confession, we've now heard that from the audio recording, we've heard that this was a pressured confession, so therefore we're ruling that evidence as inadmissible. People will say, it's all right, I hadn't factored it into my decision making anyway, and I still think they're guilty. And
I wanted to ask you about that from I don't know if you have anything to bear on that from a psychological perspective, but we've been watching a lot of vintage episodes of Law and Order lately, and quite frequently, which is American legal system, and quite frequently somebody will say something atrocious and the judge will be like, the jury will disregard that, and we're like, does that work?
How could you possibly disregard that?
Yeah, it's like one of these things that you can hear something, but you can't unhear it. You can never return to the point in time before you heard it, and that is absolutely it. In fact, there's a fair bit of research on, making these rulings that evidence is inadmissible, and what it seems to do is draw people's attention to it. So rather than just kind of going, okay, whatever. It's like, don't look at that big pink elephant in the corner of the room, and then everyone's like, oh, yeah, I'll look at that. So inadmissible evidence can't be unfactored in, essentially.
It has to be preemptively challenged, not postemptively.
You can't unhear it. So basically, don't present it if it's going to be ruled as inadmissible. But of course, that's not how it works. So even if you say this is inadmissible, jurors they'll say, oh, I didn't include it anyway. But in actual fact, there was a study that looked at known false confessors. So cases in the States where they knew the interrogation was pressured and they knew that the people were innocent. And in 81% of those cases, the jurors convicted because a confession was given. So these are people that were actually innocent, but gave a false confession. Wow. And once a confession has been given, it cannot be ungiven. And there's quite a lot of cases where people might be in a difficult situation. They might be in an interrogation. They might find it just an absolutely unbearable circumstance, and they think, right, well, I'll just say whatever, then I'll get out of this situation, and then the police will find evidence that I hadn't actually done it, and it will all be all right. But actually, it doesn't work like that.
Well,
The
once you found the answer, you often stop looking.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in a lot of certainly in the States, a lot of interrogations set out with the aim of getting a confession rather than setting out with the aim of gathering information that would enable a case to be solved. So if you get the confession, essentially you don't need to look, because an innocent person wouldn't confess. So it's it's really tricky as well, because if somebody gives a false confession, that information might be made available to people making decisions about fingerprint matches or other things. So forensic scientists might have case information, and they might be told, there's a confession here. Can you just determine whether these fingerprints are a match? And they'll be like, well, there's a confession. So they're then biased to say that it's a match. This does happen. There's research on this. But then what happens is, if the person says, well, my confession was false, and they go back to look at the case, they'll go, oh, but there's actually evidence from a fingerprint expert that the fingerprints matched. So there's corroborating evidence of guilt, even though that was never independent evidence, because it was made, the decision was made in the knowledge that there was a confession. So people can come unstuck, like trying to appeal these things, because the presence of corroborating evidence, or apparently corroborating evidence, means they just fail at the first hurdle.
And one of the things, sort of along the same line, that I was curious about is, does presumably, as you say, some of the interrogations in the US are about forcing confession rather than about gathering evidence. Does that, or is there evidence that consistently being able to extract confessions, even if they're false confessions, even if they're shown to be false confessions, creates a sort of inflated trust in their own, like the police's own hunches, or like non-scientific or non-material evidence? Like, does it just encourage a thing of, like, you get a hunch, you pick someone, you then interrogate them until they get a confession, you move on to the next one?
I mean, that's human nature, isn't it? If there's a reinforcement to that. So if you interrogate someone until you get a confession, everyone's like, good job, case closed, brilliant, okay. And then that's an incentive for you to do the same thing again. And obviously people will be different, and different tactics work on different people. But there is, I think there absolutely would be an incentive. If you can get a confession, you close a case, that's brilliant, because the public like it when the police solve crime, and the police departments like it when the police solve crime, and everybody's a winner, right? So it's reinforcing, and you will get people who are very ambitious, who will they will see that as a real motivator, regardless of kind of external reward. So yeah, absolutely, it's pretty tricky, and I'll come back to some of the US interrogation techniques later on. I do have a little bit more to say about them, but I kind of want to start out in a bit of a bit of history. So, I mean, firstly, why do you think someone would falsely confess?
So, going back to the US, which I realize we have just left, but going back to the US and their bail system, it may well be that if you can't make bail and it's a relatively minor crime, that actually confessing will see you in jail or prison for a shorter amount of time than waiting for trial, even if you're then found innocent.
Yes, so making like a false guilty plea. And a lot of people will be advised to do that, because if they plead guilty, even if they're innocent, they're going to get away with less time than if they went to trial, maybe. So yeah, absolutely.
Is there something like Munchausen syndrome here, where you seek attention?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So actually, one of the type of false confession I don't talk about so much is the voluntary false confession. So this is where people basically just rock up at a police station and go, so that thing, yeah, I did that. And that can happen for all sorts of reasons. There's a case in the States, a guy called Henry Lee Lucas. And I think I don't know if he was being questioned in connection with a murder, but he was, he basically came alive when he got police attention. They gave him cigarettes, they gave him coffee, they were very pally with him, they were very, they gave him attention, treated him like he was a friend. And so the more they did this, the more rewarding it was for him. And he ended up confessing to something like 600 murders, most of which I don't think there was any evidence had ever been committed. So yes, some people have this kind of pathological need for attention. Some people feel they feel guilty about some other transgression that they've maybe not been punished for, and so they feel the need to confess to something else just to make up for that.
Is there an element of? I mean, before we started, we were talking about like false memories and that. Is there sometimes the case of people are genuinely not sure what they were doing at a time? Maybe they've been out partying or were drunk or something like that, and they don't remember, and the police present evidence that they did it, and so they go, okay, I did it. And
absolutely, yeah. And that's a key factor. There's I mean, yeah, if you kind of drunk or you just don't remember, and you can be placed in a particular place at a particular time, you might think, well, surely I would remember murdering someone, but it doesn't have to be murder. It can be something much less memorable, I guess. And so there may be external factors that make you less confident in your memory. As you say, you just can't remember where you were at that time. But there are also people that genuinely have a kind of distrust of their own memory. They don't trust their own internal cues, and so they rely on external sources. And so if they kind of think, well, I don't really remember, but this police officer has presented me with actually quite a plausible account of what might have happened, and I don't really remember. So yeah, it's possible. And yeah.
Oh no, I was going to say, is there also the possibility that actually a third party has convinced them that they've committed the crime in some sort of gaslighting?
What about torture? Like as like whether sort of like physical violence or like psychological torture. Like I think about like other things that I've been looking at or reading recently, which is kind of like torture doesn't work because any information extracted from torture is not likely to be reliable. So that would lead me to conclude, if that's true, that therefore if a person was subjected to serious like physical or psychological torture, then they could be falsely confessing to things.
Well, that's they just say what they think the investigator wants to hear.
Yeah. So like to stop whatever's happening to them.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I mean, those are really the false confessions that I'm kind of focusing on. It's essentially because these are things that are within the justice system's power to change. They're within the justice system's power to minimize. So yeah, absolutely. So that comment was well, both comments in fact were spot on. So I like to think we don't torture people in the United Kingdom anymore, but obviously we have done this in the past. But torture is still happening in other parts of the world. We know people are being tortured, but also it can be psychological pressure. Basically, if you're in a situation and it doesn't seem to matter, how much you say, I didn't do this, I wasn't there, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't recognize that. There's no way forward as long as you're doing that. There's no way forward. And every time you deny something, no, you're wrong, you're lying. And in fact, we see this in many of the transcripts of Brendan Dassey's case. We know you're lying. You say you didn't have anything to do with it. We know what happened. So come on, be honest with us, tell us what happened. And for a lot of people, whether they're being physically tortured or whether they're being kind of psychologically pressured, they may see confessing to what they're or agreeing, complying with the request for a confession as the only way forward out of that situation. It is the logical next move for them.
The thing,
it's the, this is gonna sound weird, it's the suicide of being questioned. Like, it's the only possible way out of a situation that you can't abide staying in any longer.
One thing that an idea that I came across recently, it's not my own idea, I think it was from Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, is that, like, to this day in popular culture, and a lot of the time in children's media, children's stories, torture is depicted as something that works, that cartoon characters will get, dangled over the edge of the cliff, and they'll confess to the thing that they're supposed to be confessing to as a sort of a plot device. And as soon as I came across this idea, I was like, oh my God, we normalize this as a reliable way of extracting information from somebody. And it's so deeply ingrained.
And what torture actually does is it increases the risk of you getting a false confession.
Exactly.
It doesn't necessarily increase the likelihood of you getting a true confession. So it absolutely does not work. And again, I'll come to this later on, but the evidence is that treating people as people, even if they're guilty, even if there is evidence that they've done something horrendous, if you treat people as people, and you have empathy or you try and have empathy for them, you try and take their feelings into consideration, guilty people are much more likely to fess up, and you're not likely to put innocent people in prison. But the torture brings me on very nicely to this guy. So this is Paddy Hill of the Birmingham Six, really famous case from the 1970s, and there were quite a lot in the early 1970s where people were framed for crimes that they didn't commit. So there's the Birmingham Six who were convicted of setting off bums, Freudian slip, setting off bombs in pubs in Birmingham, which killed 21 people. There was also, around that time, the Guildford Four, who were convicted of setting off bombs in Guildford. There's the Tottenham Three, who I think were convicted of killing a PC. There's all of these cases. I think the Birmingham Six is probably the best known. And in fact, when they were exonerated in the early 90s, Paddy Hill took his compensation money, which you don't even automatically get that anymore. But Paddy Hill took his compensation money and set up a charity. And that charity's based in Glasgow. So the Miscarriage of Justice organisation was founded by Paddy Hill. And it's still ongoing now. And it's really the only charity in the UK that does casework. So takes on clients to support them. And it provides aftercare for as long as people need it. And obviously the funding for this kind of thing is appalling, because if the government were to properly fund this, the government would have to admit there was a problem, and they'd have to admit that there was an issue with the system. And so it's really difficult to support victims of miscarriage of justice. Many will just serve their sentence, because once you're in prison, unless you admit that you did something wrong, you won't be eligible for a lot of the help that's available. You might not be eligible for parole, because you have to show remorse. And if you're in denial, you're not showing remorse. So many will just serve, if they refuse to admit, they will just serve their sentences. So on top of the issue of long-term imprisonment and the impact that brings, you get the injustice and the mistrust and the anger. But what actually happened in the Birmingham Six case was they were intercepted in Morecambe, so in northwest of England. I believe they were taking a ferry from Morecambe back over to Belfast. And I think there was 5 of them, and the 6th was picked up the next day and held in a police station in Morecambe. This was November 1972, 3, very early in the 70s. And they were kind of held without blankets. It was freezing cold. And then they were transferred to the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, who proceeded to beat and torture them for days on end.
Wow.
Paddy Hill described how he was in the back of a police car and they put a gun into his mouth and pulled the trigger. They threatened to fix fatal accidents for members of the men's families. They were beaten and kind of bounced around police cells from dawn until dusk on a daily basis. And not all of the 6 did confess, but some of them did. And yeah, years later, when it all came to light, obviously the police officers who were alleged to have done these things, they might go to court. Nothing actually happens to them. So there's quite a few of these cases. They happened in the early 70s, and then it was around the early 1990s where the convictions were kind of overturned, the appeals were won, people were freed, and then it really came to light what had actually happened.
Wow.
And it was around that time that we really started to see a change in guidance for interviewing. I mean, we did have the Police and Criminal Evidence Act in the early 80s, which said that basically you have to record your interviews. You can't hold people for more than something like 96 hours. So a load of guidelines were brought in the early 80s, but it's the early 90s things really started to take off.
Sorry, if memory serves, and it may not serve in this case, wasn't there an exception to a lot of those guidelines brought in the name of anti-terrorism in the early 2000s?
Yes, associated with 9/11. Yeah.
Because I know that 72 or 96 hour waiting period was like, oh yeah, we'll make that a month if we think it's a terrorism charge or something like that.
And yeah, these exceptions can kind of get snuck through. But I mean, we know that there are still people being held in Guantanamo Bay, being tortured, and there's no evidence they've done anything wrong. They're still there. It's still happening. There's a really good book called Unjustifiable Means by Mark Fallon. It's a pretty grim read, but it is an excellent book. He's a former NCIS agent and talks about what they call these enhanced interrogation tactics, which basically means we torture people until they tell us what we want to hear. So this is now not really happening commonplace, but there are still tactics that can be used to persuade people, certainly. So so minimization and maximization are some tactics that might be used. You see these used again more in the US than you do in the UK. So minimization would be things like playing down how serious the crime was, saying the jury will empathize with you, they will understand why you did it. And we see this in Brendan Dassey's case. We know that you didn't intend to do this. It's not really your fault. You were just helping your Uncle Stephen. He told you to do it. And then there is maximization, on the other hand, which is a kind of confrontational. This is really serious. You better confess to what you've done. If you deny it, that'll be a lack of remorse. You'll get a longer sentence. We've got really strong evidence against you. And this is particularly a problem in the US, where they're still allowed to lie about evidence they've got on you. So they can tell you that they've got DNA evidence they don't have, and so on. So
I was going to ask, are these explicitly taught interrogation techniques?
Yes, as part of the Reid Technique.
Okay.
So the Reid Technique, I don't have time to go into it in detail, but it's a very clear step-by-step procedure. But what really gets me is that it's a guilt presumptive interrogation, and the guilt or innocence is established on the basis of behavioural cues that the suspect may be displaying.
Yes.
So it's based on dodgy lie detection, and you do get police officers and other professionals who go, I can definitely spot a liar. I know how they're doing it. The ways that people think they know how to spot lies is rubbish.
Hmm.
Micro expressions, all that like lie to me
Yes,
stuff.
moms.
It's
Yeah.
rubbish. Rubbish.
Well,
Nice
has anyone
story.
ever played, like, have you ever played one of those games with friends, like board games where like one of you has to be like a secret betrayer of the group? Like Sam and I play these games a lot with friends, and we play them like consistently with the same group of people. And we'll be like, oh yeah, we always know this person is always lying, whatever, and we are always wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's easier if you know someone. So
Oh,
if you
we have like the best possible chance, and we
Yeah.
still can't reliably
It's
tell.
the only thing I and the problem as well is, but the problem with doing it with friends is that you then, so we have a friend, Ella, who we've been playing these games with, and at one point I was like, yeah, you're really chatty normally, so when you go quiet, I know you're hiding something. And like for 2 or 3 games, when she'd been quiet, I knew she was one of the defectors. And of course, the moment I mentioned that, it became completely useless.
Yeah.
Because she was able to counter it. She was just chatty all the time, regardless. Like, great, cool.
That just reminds me of the time a husband turned to me and he said, I always worry when you're quiet, because if you're not eating, it means you're dead. So yeah, I am a bit of a gobshite, some might say, but it is really hard to tell when people are lying. If you know someone well, you might get an inkling, but we
Yeah.
can't really reliably do it, and you can't do it with a suspect who you don't know them that well, and also you put them in a really unusual situation, which is scary, and you may be basing your cues to deception on lots of other cases. People are different. It's just nonsense. But the Reid technique does teach officers techniques to they're basically pursuing a confession. That is the aim of it. And the manual kind of boasts about the percentage of confessions that they get in cases where the Reid technique is used. And I think places in the States now are kind of realizing it's pretty dodgy. The science now shows that you're not likely to get people to truly confess. It's likely to get false confessions. And the best approach is an information gathering approach. But there's still, obviously, the US is a very, very varied place, and there are still places where the Reid technique is, it's the technique that's used.
Wow.
So, as I say, the aim is to secure a confession. It's a really adversarial and accusatory technique, and it involves, on occasion, telling the suspect that you've got evidence on them that you haven't actually got, trying to manipulate them. If they try and say they didn't do something, you just cut off any denials, you shift the blame, and you give them lots and lots of opportunities to agree with your version of events and to confess to what they've done.
And of course, that sort of thing makes great drama in television. So
Yeah.
it's sort of promoted as, this is the way that good guys go about doing the interrogation, because their suspect is always guilty. And so it's,
It's like the Life on Mars, DCI Gene Hunt school of policing.
Yeah.
Get the phone books.
Yeah.
But of course it works because the same person gets to write the questions and then write the response, and whether or not that response is correct.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty extreme, and I think you can probably even get not the full manual, but you can get a really detailed account of the Reid technique, and you can see as you go through. If you look at Brendan Dassey's interview transcripts, and some of the I know I sent you some links to the Convoluted Brian website, but if you go on stephenaverycase.org, you can access all of the transcripts. And there's a really interesting letter on there from a psychologist that has written a detailed statement as an expert, showing how the Reid technique has been used on Brendan Dassey, and saying, I'm not offering any opinion at all as to whether Brendan is guilty or innocent. What I'm doing is highlighting vulnerabilities and where he's been manipulated, where these techniques have been shown to elicit particular responses from him. So that letter is well worth a read. There's no point me kind of going through the transcripts because the letter does it better than I could. But it makes for really interesting reading, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. You know, we're talking about a 16-year-old boy who's intellectually impaired, interviewed without a solicitor many times. And his solicitor was, like his attorney, was absolutely useless, didn't explain any of the language that, you know, adults would struggle to understand. It wasn't explained to Brendan. And so, you know, it just, regardless of whether he's guilty or innocent, his confession was not obtained by fair means. And so they don't deserve it. They don't deserve that conviction.
Wow.
So you can see if you look through the transcripts, the first interview, I think, in the November is just about, oh, what happened to Teresa? She's gone missing. Her family want to find her. You know, lots of people are worried about her. And then the next time he's interviewed is actually in school. So the police officers go to his school and they interview him in school. And he doesn't confess at that point, but they're feeding him a story. They're saying, you know, what did you see on the fire pit? And there's lines and lines where he's saying nothing. It's just silent, and they're going. And I think at one point he says toes, and they're like, oh, the toes must have been connected to a leg, and the legs must have been connected to a torso. The torso must have been connected to a head. So what you're saying is you saw a body. And it's like, no, he never said that. Actually, he never said it. So they're feeding him this story, and they're relying on his passive nature and his silence to feed him this story and reinforce to him, you know, what you're saying isn't true. Or, you know, you've said that this happened. It didn't happen like that. We know what happened. Come on, just tell us what happened. It's really important that you're honest. If you're honest with us, we've got your back. We know that Stephen put you up to it. And so they reinforce this. Come on, tell us what happened. We know what happened. Just tell us, help yourself. We've got you. We know that Stephen made you do it. And that is just fed through hours and hours and, you know, multiple different interviews. And they never even acknowledge in the later interviews that he might be innocent. It's just the case of, we know what happened. We know you're involved in it. We know you've got information. You just have to tell us. And then when he says something, he makes a detail up. They'll go, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because he's frantically scrabbling to tell them what he thinks they want to know.
So
they're guiding him. Yeah, they're correcting him.
They're correcting his confession until it makes sense, at which point they'll use that confession and not bring up the previous details necessarily.
And they're like, oh, you cut a hair off. Where did you cut a hair off? Or we cut it off in the garage. Or what did you cut it with? A knife. So what, you dragged her out to the garage and you sawed the hair off with a knife and then you took her back? No, that doesn't make any sense. Like, try again. So, you know, he's generating detail, trying to please them.
It's like one of the, I was about to say it's like one of the slot machines. I've never actually played a slot machine, but my understanding is you can like hold rollers and set other rollers going, and you keep doing it. You know, in this case, they're just going to keep rolling the dice until you get something that is a winner.
We know from just research into false memories in general that it's, if you go over a story enough times, you start to believe it, and you will start to fill in the gaps. There's lots of research where they'll ask people, you know, about crazy things like demonic possession or something like that, and they'll ask people like, well, where in the house did the demonic possession take place? And people feel the urge to fill in the gap in that question, and then they remember that that's what happened. And but doing it to someone who's already somewhat mentally impaired is just terrible.
It's atrocious. And I mean, you know, we have rules that people who are intellectually impaired or people that have, you know, mental illness, for example, will need additional support in a suspect interview, but that relies on them being assessed. It relies on that support being available. It relies on somebody being willing to pay for that support. And these things, you know, even in the UK, we know that the special measures we have, like the availability of appropriate adults, who pays for the appropriate adult, it does result in people, you know, some people just fall through the gaps. So in terms of, you know, this is a lovely graph about how interviews get false confessions. So this is just a lab study where they had students and they said, like, they're sat in a room, complete this task. Don't help anybody else with the task. So there's other people in the room. Don't help anybody else with the task. That'll be cheating. And then they leave the room, and another student who's actually a confederate of the experimenter says, "Hey, can you help me? I'm really struggling." So some said, "No, I'm not allowed to help you," and they didn't help, and others did help. So you've got true confessions and you've got false confessions. And what this actually shows here is the impact of using some of these manipulative tactics. So if there's no tactic at all, there's only 6% of people say, yeah, okay, I did falsely confess. I mean, that'd be me. Someone goes, "Did you do this?" And I go, "Oh, yes." Like even if I didn't, panic. To some, they said, if you just own up to what you've done now, we don't need to take it to the dean. If it goes to the dean, obviously it becomes very serious, might have an impact on your grades. So if you just fess up now, we'll kind of cut a deal. Some were offered a minimization. So you were just helping someone. Anybody would understand. It's very difficult to say no to somebody that asks for your help. You're just that kind of person that would help someone in need. It's understandable why you would do that, and everyone will understand. Or some people were offered the deal and the minimization, and you can see the blue bars there show that with each kind of increasing tactic, the number of false confessions massively increases. So those that were offered a deal and minimization, not quite half of them, but not far off half of them, just fessed up to something that they hadn't done. They'd not helped.
But curiously, it's a higher proportion than the deal and the minimization together. So there's an interactive effect as well. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that's interesting to me is like 6 out of 46 is a fraction. Like that's approximately 3%. Sorry, what am I saying? It's
well, no, but you were going to be actually as a weighted portion, but you don't know how many were true. Who actually committed the crime, who were investigated versus.
Well, I was going to say I did the math wrong. That's about 12%. Like just looking at the no tactic one, 6 over out of divided by 46 plus 6. So we're talking 100 minus 12 is 88% of the population didn't confess, right? Like in that first case, in the no tactic case, that's about 88%.
Well, no, you don't know how many were in each of the two buckets to begin with. It could all be there's practically nobody actually helped at all, in which case the proportion of true confessions is an even smaller portion.
Yeah, I don't have the ends, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I get it.
I mean, what you can see is that as soon as you do the deal and the minimization, the proportion of false confessions becomes much greater as a fraction of the true confessions. Yeah. So it's a cumulative effect, but also an interactive effect. So you get, it's enormously persuasive. And these were students, these are kind of university students who everyone goes, university students are really clever. They know what's going on. They're not naive. And you can go, okay, but they weren't going to prison for it, were they? They weren't even being kind of financially,
right.
They weren't even being fined for it. But we also weren't kind of yelling at people, telling them they were going to go to prison.
Wow. You can of course see why they use it as well, because I mean, obviously the number of true confessions goes up as well. So if you're just looking at how many true confessions you get, of course you're going to go, yes, okay, we'll use these techniques. It gets us the actual people confessing. The fact that it also dramatically increases the number of people who didn't do it confessing as well is probably ignored.
When you can't tell the false from the true, then the absolute number of confessions total is even goes
exactly.
up more.
Well, and presumably if evidence later on then goes on to show that actually the person was innocent, the investigators will throw their hands up and just go, well, yeah, we didn't know that time, so we couldn't have known, so it was still the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And actually, we can't tell true confessions from false confessions. Qualitatively, they will look quite similar. False confessions are frequently quite detailed because people generate the detail, and they can be detailed because the police have fed them information, or they can be detailed for all sorts of reasons. So you can't necessarily look at two statements and go, well, that's the true one and that's the false one.
Well,
and it's the same. Yeah.
I was going to say we got a question sort of related to this in the chat, which was that witnesses, and presumably this also goes on to the accused, if they're then asked questions multiple times, do they end up just reciting the first answer that they gave, or do they actually go back to the original?
Well, what actually happens, I think, is not necessarily either of those things. It's
okay.
So the first time you remember something, you'll try and recall the event. The second time you remember something, you might recall your first recall. But then you might be asked about something the third time and the fourth time and the fifth time. And what actually happens over this is you'll start to forget bits of the event. Things that don't quite add up will be forgotten. Any gaps will be filled in. And so what will happen over time is that a different narrative will be created, and it might only be subtly different, but it's not necessarily the case that there is a permanent record of the event. In fact, there isn't a permanent record of the event. And there isn't even a permanent record of your first recall, because as soon as you recall a second time, your memory changes. So that there is no kind of verbatim, unchangeable memory.
Well, and I remember in another, bringing up again, Malcolm Gladwell's books, he talks about a study that was done in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 on, I think it was flashbulb memories was the thing. But basically, they, large group of academics went out, got everyone to write down what their day was like, what happened, basically their memory of the event. And they came back a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, and then asked them to rewrite it, and then compared the two. And I think they found that by 5 years later, about half the details were different. But interestingly, when the participants were then confronted with this, their response wasn't, oh, geez, my memory must be rubbish. It was, I don't know why I wrote this, because this isn't what happened. What I remember is what happened.
Wow.
The thing that I wrote down was wrong. Even though, of course, that's contemporaneous. That was the most accurate.
It's like in their own handwriting.
In their own handwriting, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's easier to say, I must have been mistaken earlier on, than to say, actually, what I remember now is wrong.
Yeah.
It's much easier to say, well, I must have maybe been in shock.
So you're telling us not to trust our memories, but you're telling us not trusting our memories makes us more likely to confess. So what do I do?
What do you do? What do you do? Well, I mean, I think the bottom line is be aware of the shortcomings of your memory, but it doesn't inoculate you against the effect. So you need to be aware that your memory isn't accurate. My advice, because I'm always asked, what do I do if the police want to interview me? What do I say? Do I give a no comment interview? What do I? And I just say, do not say anything without a solicitor. Do not speak to the police without a solicitor ever. And some solicitors will be crap. If you've not read The Secret Barrister, that is quite an eye opener. It's excellent, and it's quite depressing, but it's an excellent book. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer. Is the bottom line, unfortunately. Your memory is fallible. Write stuff down, I guess. When something happens, write it down, and then you stick with that as your permanent record, and that is your purest recall. But that doesn't take into account the fact that you might be in shock after something's happened. You might have forgotten things. You might fill things in later. And we've gathered more information about 9/11 that maybe we go, oh, I thought that this would happen. I thought that this had happened. But actually that thing that came out that I saw on the news, that would contradict that. So maybe I couldn't have remembered that. And then we start to kind of adjust things. So, but there's lots of reasons why people would be vulnerable to false confessions. So, for example, youths, for a start, they don't really have the ability to tolerate interpersonal stress. They're much more likely to try and please people in authority. And so they're not likely to be as able to resist kind of demands for confessions. They are, they don't have the same level of kind of reasoning and problem solving that we have as adults. So they're much more likely to be at risk of false confessions than adults are. People with low IQ, developmental disabilities, suggestibility and compliance are two key factors.
What are those? Are those sort of like measurable, like personality traits?
Yeah, they are. And actually, there's a psychologist called Gisli Gudjonsson that's actually it is worked with people like the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, and he's used these kind of constructs. He's used these tests on them, and found that the ones that confessed were higher in interrogative suggestibility and higher in compliance than those that didn't. So suggestibility is the extent to which you are willing to take on a suggestion from somebody else. So that might happen, for example, because you don't trust your own memory. So if somebody suggests to you, this is what happened, you might go, oh, yeah, okay. Or if somebody says, actually, no, your answer's wrong, try again. Someone who's high in suggestibility might be more likely to change their answers to try and get it right the next time. Whereas people who comply try and keep the peace. They try and avoid confrontation at any cost. And so suggestibility and compliance go hand in hand a lot of the time. And they're related, but they're different.
Right.
But then you get people who, for example, there are some people who aren't always firmly in touch with reality. And this might be to do with substance dependency, but it might be to do with faulty reality monitoring that comes about as a result of a mental illness. So people with schizophrenia, for example, frequently can be somewhat detached from what's actually happening. There's talk about schizophrenia as being a disorder of the self, a disorder of feeling that you're the author of your own actions, that you're conductor of your own orchestra, if you like. So all of these things can make people more vulnerable. And so if you put people with any of these vulnerabilities in a situation where pressure is applied to them, then those things become very dangerous. They interact.
I was going to ask you about memory distrust. I can imagine that there'd be loads of sort of medical conditions that could result in it. Could it also be induced in a person due to prior sort of psychological conditioning, like
what, gaslighting?
Gaslighting is maybe like a less extreme version. I don't know, or just like sort of like abusive, relationships or things like that. Like, or would there be reasons that somebody could develop memory distrust in a non, biological way?
Yes. Yeah, so people can come to have less trust in their memories, and it may be because they feel more dissociated. They don't feel like they're connected to what's happening a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But it may be because they've been contradicted, or they've been told that they're wrong, or they've had other versions of events presented to them. So it's not necessarily something biological that you're born with. And this is the next is a really good case. So there's a guy in the States, Paul Ingram. It's quite a well-known case. He was accused by his daughters of sexually abusing them. And Paul Ingram was a very religious man, and he couldn't quite marry up the fact that, he knew he hadn't done this, but also he'd raised his daughters to be good people, and his daughters wouldn't lie. And so he was really wrangling with how did he reconcile these two things. And his daughters then said, not only did our dad abuse us, but we've seen him taking part in satanic rituals with infants, and he's murdered them. He's been involved in murder of all of these babies as part of these satanic rituals. And he's like, but I've never done this. But he couldn't quite figure out how the allegations had come about. But he was interviewed something like 24 times over 6 months. But this involved interrogations from the police, but also interrogations from his church minister, including interrogations when he was hypnotized. And he was also told, Satan could have made you do these things, but then erase your memory. That's a possible thing that could have happened. And so Paul Ingram actually came to believe temporarily, but he came to believe that he had abused his daughters and murdered infants as part of these satanic rituals. And when the interrogation stopped, he was like, hang on a minute, what was all like? I never did that. I know I didn't do it. But he actually served his full sentence for the abuse of his daughters. There was no evidence that there had been any of these satanic ritual related crimes, but it was the time of the satanic panic in the States, which then of course came over here. And he served his time, and he briefly believed that he must have committed the crime. So people can be led to internalize that guilt. And there's slightly more innocuous studies that psychology's done, but there's a phenomenon known as imagination inflation, where you get people, there's a study where people were asked to kind of go through a life events inventory and say whether these things had happened to them as a child, so kind of having a hot air balloon ride or having a procedure at the hospital, blah blah blah. And a week later they get the participants back and they say, I want you to imagine, and they get them to imagine something that didn't happen to them. So the week before they said, this never happened to me. They get them to imagine it, and they get them to imagine it in detail. Who was there? When was it? Where did it happen? Oh, by the way, we lost your inventory that you filled in last week. Can you fill another one in now? And they found that people's confidence that these events that had never happened to them had in fact happened to them increased. So just imagining that you've done something in detail increases your, I guess, acceptance that they might have happened. And this is hugely problematic because one of the techniques the police might use is taking a suspect to a crime scene and saying, act out what you did. Tell me how you did it. Show me what you did. And that's enormously problematic.
Because it's not like we have a list of things we have and haven't done in our brains. Presumably, in order to know whether or not we've done something, we then have to go back and just rack our brains to see whether or not we've done it. And so by imagining it, we are essentially creating a relatively thin record of having done it.
But if you then imagine it and you reenact it over and over again and you're asked to recall that version over and over again, it can become more familiar than what actually happened. Certainly if you don't actually remember what happened. Yeah. So what we call internalized false confessions are possible. And these can lead to kind of false memory syndrome, where people go on to believe that they've actually committed crimes they've never done. So, I mean, the bottom line, I realize we're running swiftly out of time, but I think I've referred a few times to kind of, unethical interviewing, poor interviewing practice. We're not really supposed to say coercive because that implies physical coercion, but we can say pressured. I think it's easy to see how people might be put into situations where the pressure is such that the only way they see out is to go along with what's being demanded of them. Even if it's not being explicitly demanded, if you know that what you're saying isn't getting you anywhere, then you try saying different things until it seems to move forward. And so what people need to understand is that for many people, making a false confession is the only logical move for them. It is the only way out of an unbearable situation. And, I don't think it's actually that hard to understand how that would come about. And so really, this just very briefly, we do have good strategies for conducting interviews. We have what's called the Peace model in England and Wales, the Price model in Scotland. which is a kind of more structured approach to interviewing, but it's based on information gathering. People are invited to take part in the interview. You tell them that they're the expert. You don't have the information they have. You use questions that are compatible with the witness or the suspect. You know, you ask them straightforward questions they can understand. You don't judge them. You don't contradict them. You don't cut them off mid-sentence. They're treated as an equal.
And are there any ramifications if this procedure isn't followed? Like, does any information extracted from that interview become inadmissible evidence?
Not necessarily. I mean, and there's some cases, I guess, where you might need to deviate from an approach because somebody is not being,
right.
You know, they're kind of not being cooperative, and you might try different things. But the research that I know of shows that really the vast majority of interviews that we do in the UK are following an ethical kind of, you know, they're following these structures. They're coming from an ethical information gathering standpoint. But what we do need is to make sure that those interviews are effective, you need to have good training. Not everybody makes a good interviewer.
Yeah.
And so it's making sure that the right people are in the job and that they're in, you know, that their skills are great. But when that's done, we find that actually, you know, if you use ethical interviewing, even with sex offenders who you know are guilty, if you treat them as a person, if you understand that, yeah, they might have a need to confess, but they're going to have to overcome enormous feelings of shame. Sex offenders are more likely to disclose details of their crimes if they're treated as people than if you basically treat them as, you know, whatever you think they are.
Right.
And you know, these are horrendous crimes that you know they're the worst of the worst crimes we can think of. But if you treat people as people, you're much more likely to get crime relevant details that will help an investigation, and you're much less likely to get false confessions from people that are innocent.
Wow.
So
there's no reason not to do it.
There's no reason not to do it. You know, torturing people doesn't work.
Yeah.
It absolutely does not work. So I guess that's where we are. I thought I had another slide in, I didn't, but I guess it's just understanding that, you know, some people are very vulnerable to false confessions, some are more vulnerable than others, but there's also situational characteristics. And as with any human behavior, it's a product of who you are and the situation that you're in. But we do have these ethical interviewing practices, and actually the UK is kind of world leading in this. But we need to make sure that people are trained properly, that appropriate support is in place for vulnerable suspects and vulnerable witnesses as well, but vulnerable suspects. And we need, you know, more cooperation, I guess, between scientists and practitioners to make sure that everything's joined up. It's no point us doing research in a vacuum and then them going, well, that's no use to us. So it relies on this cooperation. I don't think I'm getting messages from the chat. So if I have missed any questions,
we've been keeping an eye on it.
You've been keeping an eye on them. That's. So yeah, I guess that's where we. You know, I could talk for another 3 hours on this, but
and we'd love to listen.
People have things to do, and I need to have my tea. But does anyone have any questions?
I think we've been filtering through all the questions as we've been going.
I start off with a list, but I think we've hit pretty much. I think we've hit everything.
Yes.
That's great. I find that often people will ask questions and I'll go, and that's on the next slide.
that was it. Yeah, every question that we had seemed to segue really nicely.
But that's really reassuring that people are asking the things that I do actually get to. But yeah, I've really enjoyed it. So thanks for thanks for listening, folks.
No, thanks for.
I do have. You can get me on Twitter at Lightfaber, mostly for cats.
Great.
Photos of cats. My university email address f.skelton@napier. My website is under construction. There's nothing there at the moment, but I need to pull my finger out and get it sorted. I'm just not very on the ball with it, but follow me on Twitter. Drop me an email if you have other questions. I'm quite happy to chat once I've got to the bottom of my to-do list.
Yeah,
we've got one last question that's just come in. Oh yes, okay. He's just clarified on it. I Can Science That has asked whether there's any evidence from the functional fMRIs about being able to tell whether people's memories are genuine or whether they're constructed. Is that something you know anything about?
So I've looked more at fMRI research in terms of lie detection, because of course there's companies in the States that are going, fMRI is brilliant, we can spot lying bits of the brain, which they can't. My understanding is that at the moment we can't reliably tell a genuine memory from like a rehearsed false memory, because they would both involve some sort of visualization. They would probably both involve some sort of recall, whether it was recall from the event or recall from an early remembering. And so I'm not completely up to date on the research, but I don't think as yet fMRI is reliably distinguishing between those things. It's pretty magic, but it's not quite as magic as the public are led to believe it is.
Cool.
And the brain definitely doesn't light up.
Well, thank you very much, Faye. That was a wonderful talk. We've had some really positive comments in the chat saying how much they've enjoyed it. So that's really great. So for the next one, I haven't managed to sort out a graphic for this because we're still trying to nail down what the topic is going to be. But next time we're going to be talking to Science is Dope, who's a skeptic in India and addresses some really interesting things that are more unique to that part of the world than to what we're used to, which is quite interesting. We're going to be also doing that on a Wednesday night rather than a Tuesday in order to fit in with his schedule. We will obviously release more information about that as we get closer to the time. But anyway, yes, that's our show for the evening. Thank you very much again, Faye. That was wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for your comments and for watching. And we'll see you again next time. Night.
Great.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.